This content relates to Chapter 12, Sexual Disorders and Variants. We'll talk about sexual dysfunction in men and women, gender dysphoria, transgender, and transsexuality. And we'll have part 2 lecture related to the hormonal underpinnings of these. And we'll also have as a guest the father of a transgender child. And then we'll talk about paraphiliac disorders, 4 types in particular, and sexual abuse and its consequences. Our overview will just give us a way to think about this a little bit. If we consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can wonder where sex fits into this. And in this model, Maslow presents to us that physiological needs are at the lowest level, meaning that these are our bodily functions, our needs for water, air, we might say light, food, our physiological needs. Safety and security is the next level, and that's our need for, say, living in a secure neighborhood, being safe within our family, not living in a war-torn region, having our health needs met, having a job we can depend on. And of course, if our physiological needs aren't met, we'll probably look for food before we seek our safety. And love and belongingness, our next level, where we seek to belong and have an established network and community or family that we're with. Our esteem needs relate to, say, our dignity within the community, so our pursuit of an education, our desire to be recognized and accepted and to contribute. And then self-actualization is we generally seek when all of these things are met. So we're seeking to maximize our individual self. So just a review of Maslow's hierarchy. So where does sex fit into all of this? Well, Maslow himself placed it, albeit with question marks, in this physiological tier, considering it to be a need, a physiological need of our human bodies. And although some individuals can surpass this, typically we have to have our physiological needs met before we can pursue on to higher levels. And so if there is that huge sex drive, especially during adolescence, maybe you'll think of the familiarity of the overriding focus that one would have on it at the expense of maybe safety, the risks a person would take. Maybe love and belongingness, sex and love are not necessarily the same. Maybe that would come before our schooling needs, and perhaps it would come before, very likely it would come before our spiritual development. So we can consider that this is a need. And it's a need that we share with other creatures, that we share with even plants, where the ovaries are within the female plants, and the pollen contains the means of producing sperm, and the transfer mechanism is through bees and other pollinators. But of course, many creatures who reproduce sexually do so by copulating, similar to what humans do, even bugs, animals of all sorts, and then, of course, humans. And so this is a reproductive technique that we share with other creatures. And so what's the difference? What are the sociocultural influences on sexual practices and standards, or how are we different from animals in terms of sexuality? We can think of this then in terms of the brain, with sexual behavior being a primitive drive, sort of like the limbic system in our brain, or even lower levels, the reptilian system. And so we can think of it in this way. So we share our basic reptilian brain with other creatures, even down to the reptiles. And that is the part of the brain that relates to basic bodily functions, things like mechanisms related to sleep or to sneezing or to breathing, things like that, very old. And then our emotional systems we share with other mammals, and that is like the presence of our amygdala for emotion, especially fear, our hippocampus with relation to memory, our production of dopamine, and this too is old. And so these might relate to our instincts and our basic physiological functionality. But where we humans are unique is in our neocortex, this outer region of the brain, and in particular our prefrontal cortex, which allows us to focus attention, have compassion, free will, judgment, planning. And with this prefrontal cortex, we can think abstractly. And so the fact of this ability to think abstractly in combination with these more primitive systems brings us to all kinds of problems. So main differences then, humans are aware of their own sexuality, whereas animals are not thinking about it outside of the moment of opportunity. Unlike animals, human sexuality is not exclusively for reproduction. Most animals females go into an estrus or a heat where they are reproductively viable, and it's only at that stage where they are receptive to male sexual advances, whereas humans are not only receptive during that time. Human sexual cognition can lead to sexual feelings outside of sexual stimuli. And so what does this mean? It means we can think about something sexual, and that can lead us to experience a physical sexual response, even if there's nothing except the presence of the image in our own minds. And this is not true of animals. And humans have the capacity to override sexual impulses, whereas animals, if it's there, they're going for it. And we can think of an example of this as these monks who have chosen to rise above sexual behavior. And so all of this brings us to challenges related to sexual dysfunction, our concern about libido, things like pornography and sexual harassment, sex roles, sexual abuse, date rape. All of these issues are related to the fact of our ability to be different from animals and cognitively process sexual behavior. So let's start with the first topic your text introduces, which is sexual dysfunction. And we can think of it as an impairment either in the desire for sexual gratification or in the ability to achieve it. And so we have differences between males and females in this region. However, dysfunction can occur in any of the 4 phases of sexual behavior. So the desire phase consists of fantasies about sexual activity or desire to have sexual activity, and abnormalities can occur in this area. The arousal phase is characterized by the feeling, the subjective sense or feeling of sexual pleasure, as well as the physiological changes in the body accompanying this subjective pleasure. And problems can occur at this stage. And the experience of orgasm, that release in males ejaculation and females various physiological responses, as well as a feeling of great pleasure. And there can be problems with this for both males and females. And during resolution, that is after post-orgasm, the sense of relaxation and well-being can also have impairments. And we don't talk about this directly in this chapter, but if one has been had experiences of sexual abuse, then the feeling of relaxation and well-being, as well as other aspects of this sexual process, might be impaired. So male sexual dysfunction comes in 4 areas, and in the notes these are elaborated on, and of course they're in your book as well. But I'll point out a couple of things in addition to this. So premature ejaculation, or ejaculating before a male wants to, is more typical in younger men. The rest of these are more typical in older men. So hypoactive, meaning suboptimal sexual desire, so more common in older men, so the person doesn't feel the desire that they would like to. Erectile disorder, in which the male has the desire but can't get or sustain an erection, again more common in older men. And then delayed ejaculation, the opposite of this other problem, also more common in older men. And what we might point out within all of this is that these are treated as disorders. Often we might consider, however, a function in males that parallels the female menopause, and that is called andropause, and it's the natural decline in male hormones as males age. And so you can look at this image, and the pink represents testosterone level, and in the 20s, males have a lot of testosterone. But if you look at the lighter pink shades going through this series of ages, you can see that these testosterone levels decline with each decade. So even a little bit of a decline in a man's 30s, and more in 40s and 50s and 60s, much less testosterone, 70s even less, and 80s and 90s even less. So although males remain reproductively viable, that is, their bodies, their gonads are still producing sperm, even if in reduced amounts, the ability to function sexually declines because that is dependent, the libido is dependent on these levels of testosterone. So this is a natural process. In females, it occurs quite a bit more abruptly. In a woman's 50s, that all of the estrogens drop off rather markedly and menarche ceases, and so that happens kind of dramatically. But we often forget about this natural decline for males as well. And so we have a number of things identified as sexual dysfunction that don't seem to take into account these natural declines in testosterone. So we know androgens are linked to male sexual drive and arousal. These naturally decline as men age, and perhaps denial of andropause and this reverence for youth that seems to be present in American mainstream culture might contribute to the perception of declining sexual function and label it a disorder when in fact it's just a natural process of aging. And we might also wonder, does it make sense that both males and females have a decline in these sex hormones as they age and no longer have the capacity perhaps to raise a child into adulthood? And so perhaps this is adaptive in the sense that if a male fathers a child in their 60s, for example, are they really able to raise that child to adulthood? Like, is that really a feasible outcome? And so perhaps the fact that they're less capable of fathering a child in their 60s might make some sense. So I just offer that to you as something that doesn't seem to be often discussed, but it does relate directly to sexuality in males. Female dysfunction tends to fall in 3 areas. Sexual interest arousal disorder early in the stages, and it doesn't affect all women, but it can occur in women of all ages. Genitopelvic pain or pain during sex can occur in all ages, but it does tend to increase with aging as the bodily fluids decrease. And then organismic disorder, usually diagnosed between the ages of 21 and 24. That doesn't mean it only occurs in those ages, however, it's just that's when it's diagnosed. And more information about these as well is provided in the notes and in your text. So we move on then to sexual disorders, and we talk about 4 types: paraphilias, gender issues, sexual abuse, and we've already addressed sexual dysfunction. You might wonder, where does homosexuality fall in all of this? And the answer is it doesn't. In the very first version of the DSM, homosexuality was considered to be a disorder, but already in 1973, as we began to understand more about homosexuality, this has been eliminated from the DSM. It's no longer considered a disorder, and it hasn't been considered a disorder for half a century. So paraphilic disorders are recurrent, intensely sexually arousing fantasies, urges, or behaviors. So thoughts, again, we're looking at these abstractions, and they involve abnormal targets of sexual attraction, such as feet is a common target. Unusual courtship behaviors, such as this person exposing himself, not a very effective method, or desiring pain and suffering of oneself or others. So these are the types of paraphilic paraphilias. The key criteria are that they're recurrent, intense, so it's not just a one-time fantasy, these are ongoing, more than 6 months, and they cause distress or impairment to the person involved, and intense fantasies and arousal. And these could be fetishism, meaning a sexual attraction for non-sexual objects or body parts. That's the foot example that we talked about earlier. Other things as well, though. High heels might be an example, or anything can be fetishized. Transvestism is cross-dressing. Pedophilia, sexual activity with a prepubescent child, less than 13 years. That's either acted on, or the person has fantasies about it and they are distressed by their fantasies. Voyeurism, observing someone who doesn't know that they're being observed during sexual behavior or dressing, undressing, that sort of thing. Exhibitionism is exposing one's genitals to an unsuspecting person. Frauderism is touching or rubbing against a non-consenting person. Sexual sadism, inflicting physical or psychological suffering on another person for the sake of one's own sexual gratification. And masochism is the opposite of this, the act of being humiliated, bound, beaten, or made to suffer. Gender dysphoria is a dysphoric state is a very disagreeable a sense of being out of harmony with what should be in harmony. Persistent distress resulting from a perceived mismatch between one's assigned gender at birth and their gender identity. So the distress is the dysphoria, that sense of mismatch or not belonging, and this relates to gender, making it gender dysphoria. Now, this can be diagnosed at 2 different life stages. During childhood, some children from a very young age identify as the opposite of their sex, their physical sex. And sometimes they grow out of this and other times they don't. And the other time then that gender dysphoria is diagnosed is during adolescence or adulthood. So as those hormones surge and the adult sexual gender, the adult gender emerges, this can be a really distressing time for someone who has this dysphoric state related to gender. And so this is another time when they might voice these concerns and get help. So we could have transsexualism, the term for people with gender dysphoria who desire to change their sex. So female to male. In our talk coming up, there are other acronyms for this, but we'll leave these terms in here as the ones introduced in your text. So most of these begin in childhood and they are sexually attracted to women. And so they're born as female and they feel that they are a male living within the female body. Male to female is a little bit different. Autogynophilic, which is a paraphilia with arousal associated with fantasies and images of oneself as a woman. And you could have homosexual types who are very feminine. Some orient as gay, but most consider themselves heterosexual because they're trapped in a male body and they're attracted to heterosexual partners. So what we're talking about then is a person in a male body who is attracted to other males, but not male to male as in a homosexual, but female to male because they believe themselves to be female within that male body. And as we already mentioned, homosexuality is not included in the DSM, although I do address it a little bit in that lecture about the hormonal factors. So treatment for gender dysphoria, oh, this is so complicated. Children and adolescents with gender dysphoria are often brought in by their parents for psychotherapy. So this is a complicating thing for all of the family members, as well as for the person with gender dysphoria. Because these children have had such a state of being raised in the body that is opposite what they believe themselves to be, this can create a lot of distress. And so children who have this often have general psychological and behavioral problems, perhaps related to this sense of being outcast and not being accepted by others, or being untrue to what one believes oneself to be. Most children with gender dysphoria don't become adults with gender dysphoria, so they work their way through it, either reconciling their sex or taking active steps to resolve their sex by changing their sexuality, changing their gender. So individuals who were children with gender dysphoria and they persist in that gender dysphoria in adolescence are likely to remain so in adulthood and may decide to transform their bodies. And the age at which this happens, either they really get reinforced that they're the wrong sex, or they step back from it and reconcile the physical sexes between the ages of 10 and 13. Now, one documentary that you'll see that I posted up for you is the story of these two identical twin boys. And I'll tell you the story a little bit and then explain to you why it's relevant here. So Bruce and Brian Reimer were identical twin boys born in 1965. About my age they'd be. They were very healthy, but they had a little bit of a problem around 9 months of age, a common problem with boys, infant boys who are uncircumcised. But their parents decided that a circumcision would be a wise choice because of this problem. And so at 9 months, they went for the circumcision. Bruce went in first, and unfortunately, a new surgical method was used that was botched. And much of his penis was accidentally removed. And his parents didn't have big educations. They were barely out of high school when they got married and had these babies. And so they sought help from a really renowned doctor who paid all of their medical expenses and recommended that they remove the rest of his male genitals and raise Bruce as a girl. This doctor told the parents that it wouldn't matter, that the baby was young enough it wouldn't matter. And so they did so. They renamed him Brenda. And so here are two baby boys. And here are, after they were reassigned as a boy and a girl. And here they are in their elementary school years. Identical twins, meaning they have exactly the same chromosomes, but one was reassigned as a girl. So it didn't go that well. At age 2, Brenda would tear off her dresses, refuse to play with dolls. She did not see herself as a girl. Here's a picture of that age. Beat up her brother, seized his toy cars and guns. In the school years, she was bullied. Other kids called Brenda Cave Woman and teased her for her masculine gait, tastes, and behaviors. She got into trouble frequently, petty crimes. She was gender dysphoric, never felt female. At adolescence, female hormones were introduced, causing her to grow breasts, and by age 13, she was seriously depressed and threatened suicide if she had to go back to that doctor. At age 15, father revealed the truth to her. She stopped the hormones, remained herself David, and took steps to reverse the process. And you can see that from this little girl, now a young man, correctly back into the skin that she felt comfortable in, or that he felt comfortable in, and these other brothers together. In adulthood, he underwent surgery to correct his gender. By age 21, he had the physical surgeries necessary for him to become male again. And of course, he stopped taking estrogen and began taking testosterone. He had physical labor as his job. This is him with his brother. He worked as a cleanup crew in a slaughterhouse, jobs of that sort, very kind of masculine physical jobs, and eventually married a woman who already had children. So he had a family. But the ending is tragic despite that. He suffered bouts of depression. He had attempted suicide a couple of times in his 20s. And in but at the age of 38, he committed suicide with a shotgun. His brother Brian, his twin brother, had also died of suicide 2 years earlier. And his mother had suffered from depression for many years. So you can see there's quite a lot of diathesis in the family for mental illness, but we certainly know that not every mother who suffers depression has children who suffer suicidal depression. And so we have to consider the trauma that both of these boys faced in their growing years. So this is a book that was a large part of the source of information for me. It's actually quite a well-done book. It covers the tragedy of the Reimer family, but also the scientific blunders and egoism that led to it getting as bad as it got. So causing this bad situation with the botched circumcision to become intolerable and irreparable. So I recommend the book, actually. So why is this relevant? This is obviously an anomalous case. This is not, a dysphoria that came out of the blue. This is a dysphoria related to surgery. However, this is very much like transgender individuals. The individuals who is transgender has that very same feeling that Brenda had when she was renamed a girl but lived in that boy's body. This is what they describe it as, the same as what Brenda felt, and the same kinds of problems emerged. So both Brenda and transgender people have this innate knowing that one is not one's designated sex. So Brenda knew that, but that's just what is described by transgender people. That sense of isolation, not belonging, not fitting, described by transgender people. Trouble in school, stemming possibly from that dysphoric state. This plunge into depression that worsens around the time of puberty, just when those sex hormones surge. Those hormones that might almost give one the sensation of toxic or poisonous if they're transgender, if they're the opposite hormones. And then finally, a feeling of freedom and relief of depression, at least temporarily, upon the realization and acknowledgement and acceptance of transgender status. So our last topic is sexual abuse. And sexual abuse is a worldwide problem. Worldwide, 1.6%, USA, 4 to 6%. But this isn't a good way to reliably understand the problem because definitions might vary across the world. The freedom to report sexual abuse might vary, so this doesn't necessarily imply that it's worse in the US than in other places. There are significant consequences. Children who are sexually abused are two times more likely to develop mental illness, as just one example. But correlational studies, we obviously can't set up experiments to test this. Incest is one type of it. Incest is sexual interaction of any kind between people in the same family. And of these, most common is sibling incest, one sibling abusing another sibling. And the second is father-daughter incest. And if that happens, it might happen to one child and then to another child as they reach a certain age that is seeming to appeal. And rape is considered an act of violence rather than sex, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And again, sexual abuse is implicated in many abnormal psychology disorders, including several personality disorders, depression and anxiety, eating disorders, and suicidality. So it's a big deal. And so, as mentioned, twice as likely than those who are not abused to develop a mental disorder. Significantly increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors later. And I alluded to this earlier. It can have other symptoms like sexual aversion, that is, trouble feeling sexual desire, or difficulty achieving orgasm, achieving gratification through sexual behavior, or difficulty feeling relaxed and easy in a relationship that has sexual components. And so these often play in as female sexual dysfunctions, but they would stem from that anxiety that comes of those abusive early experiences. And you can't, and so sexuality is an important part of intimacy and the important part of adult relationships. And so when it is troubled, it's a bad consequence. It's difficult for the marriage and therein for the stability of the family. And so sexual aversion is one outcome, and sexual promiscuity, or really just making oneself sexually available and visible to a lot of different people, is another kind of flip side of that same outcome, and that's equally harmful. It's harmful and degrading to the person who is promiscuous. It increases the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancy, and it promotes objectification of women. And also, this woman who's engaged in sexually promiscuous behavior is also having a gap between sexual behavior and intimacy, with the intimate relationship being a healthy place for sexual behavior. But there's disconnect there for this person who has been sexually abused. So sometimes this is because of pedophilia, that is, childhood sexual abuse is because of pedophilia, that is, an adult who has recurrent intense sexual urges or fantasies about sexual activity with a pre-pubertal child, generally age 13 or younger. And there are different terms, as you'll read, for appeal of different ages. Nearly all pedophiles are male. 2/3 of the victims are girls between the ages of 8 and 11. The pedophiles believe that these children benefit from the sexual contact, and even suggest or believe that the children have initiated that sexual contact, and that they enjoy it. And many people, let's be careful about how we read this, but many pedophiles do choose jobs working with children or youth, so they have extensive access to them. But that doesn't mean that many people who work with children or youth are pedophiles, so don't flip that around. It just means that pedophiles have this very strong desire, and they may act on it by getting jobs working with children. Rape is another abuse, sexual abuse. Penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And this is the key factor right here, without consent. This is a can of worms in and of itself, because what is consent? And so, as we all are familiar with lately, the Me Too movement has really highlighted this. What is consent? How is it made? Where are the lines drawn? And so this is a difficult area that both boys and girls need to have directly a bit of guidance on. Statutory rape is sexual activity with a person who's legally defined to be under the age of 18, even if that underage person consents. And that means that even in a relationship between teenagers, when one of them becomes a legal adult and the other doesn't, there is that risk that statutory rape, if they're sexually involved, could come into play. Although that would be a rare case. More typically, these are occurring in cases like Brian Epstein, who was a very famous man he's now passed, but he was all throughout his life. He was taking advantage of his position of power to engage very young girls. And into his 50s and even his 60s, he was doing these sorts of things. So that's typically the person who would get accused and convicted of statutory rape. And sexual assault refers to acts separate from rape that involve unwanted sexual contact. groping, fondling another person without their consent. We heard a lot of this too in the Me Too movement. These are dated statistics on sexual assault. These are right from your book. So we can see that rape per 1,000 females aged 12 or older, and this is the age at which they're happening. And you can see that younger women are so vulnerable. And so 12 to 17 is the most common age, and that's a small age range. I mean, this is a 6-year age span. And here we have 18 to 34, 16 years. And even with that, the rate is lower. And so these young girls really are quite vulnerable. And then as women get older, these rates decline significantly. What I did find when I looked up a more current data set is that the numbers were very similar. I couldn't find another chart that looked this clear, but I did find that these numbers are very similar. So this seems to be the way these things play out. And so even though it's a violent act, it's still traditionally classified as a sex crime because rapists generally talk about sexual motivations as a cause for their actions, not sometimes otherwise thought. And sometimes rapists do have features associated with paraphilias, as we've discussed earlier. So rape can be an extremely traumatic experience for a woman. It can be severe. It can lead to PTSD. It's not to be underestimated. Sexual abuse can be a precipitant of many, or at least a contributor to many psychological disorders. And it can be hard to talk about. Even today, there's a lot of self-blame. Someone who is raped thinking, oh, it's because I wore that top. Or it's because I had a drink at the party, or I must have somehow asked for it. And so that really is something that needs to be reconciled. And so even a woman who feels ashamed that she drew it on, it's going to be beneficial to talk about this experience and work through it, because that guilt and the trauma of it can really impede later experiences. And so this next point is getting at that. There remains a myth of victim-precipitated rape, where the victim is regarded as the cause of the crime, or worse, she regards herself as the cause of the crime. And we do have rape shield laws that protect rape victims by limiting defendants' ability to introduce evidence of a victim's sexual history. What this means is so this would be the story that a woman might say if she's been attacked and raped. She might say, well, it's because my top was too tight, and it's because I looked at him too long in the eye and I smiled. And plus, look at me, I had another person that I slept with before this. And so these laws are just designed to say, all right, we can't take into account whether a woman has had previous interactions, previous sexual history. None of this is relevant. Rape is rape, regardless of whether the woman has had sex before or not. So, causal consideration: the perpetrators of rape are overwhelmingly male, are impulsive, have a quick temper, so they haven't done a lot with self-regulation. They often don't have personal, intimate relationships, so they're kind of isolated. And they are insensitive to social cues or pressures, so maybe aren't cognizant of the effect they're having. And they show deficits in social and communication skills, and so violence may be the way they choose to communicate. Perpetrators justify their rape with things like, I had too much alcohol, couldn't help it. She didn't resist enough. I didn't know she meant no. She led me on. She was teasing me. And so we have to dismiss all of these things. Adult men and women have the capacity to control themselves. We're not animals. And so all of these sorts of things, these excuses, these are disingenuous and dishonest. It is a navigation when we're talking about sexual things, but every single human being has the capacity to control that behavior. And so that's where we differ from animals, and that's why we have to dismiss these excuses and hopefully help young men and young women to learn more about their own sexuality and avoid these problems. Psychotherapies that have been used in a variety of situations where people are having paraphilias or sexual behaviors they don't want, there's retraining that takes place. So aversion therapy, so a paraphilic stimulus, meaning the stimulus that is appealing to the person, sexually appealing, is paired with an aversive event. So, for example, if someone has a foot fetish and wants to be relieved of it, then every time they see a shoe, they might have a shock administered to them that would link together the shoe with a bad experience. Covert sensitization. The patient would imagine a highly aversive event while viewing or imagining a paraphilic stimulus. So it's similar to this, except instead of an actual event that's aversive, this is an imagined aversive event. Assisted covert sensitization. A foul odor is introduced to introduce nausea at the point of peak arousal when a person wants to get rid of unwanted sexual fantasies or fetishes. Cognitive restructuring is restructuring of thought processes, which is an attempt to eliminate sex offenders' cognitive distortions because these may play a role in sexual abuse. So maybe a person who is wont to Voyeurism or to exhibitionism, there might be some thought disorder going on there, and maybe they think that this person wants it or something like that. And so cognitive restructuring would attempt to help to change that errant cognition. And social skills training aims to help sex offenders process social information from women more effectively and to interact with them more appropriately. And I think a little bit more sex education for young people would be beneficial for most people. So not that we're waiting for a person to have problems, but that we're proactively talking about these topics, which are so very difficult and so important. And we could get through a lot of challenges if these things could be a little more on the table. As far as treatments, often there's a hormone therapy in combination with cognitive behavioral treatment, depending on the severity and the nature of the problem and the potential harm to others. The next content then is on sexuality and biology, and we'll save that for another lecture.